Kara, now that you're a regular part of our team, how would you like to see SecX change the world?
Oh man, well, I'm super excited to be a part of the team. I didn't know part of the job description was, quite such a lofty goal. I don't, but I love the work that is happening here, and I do think it actually is. Um, maybe not change the world, but maybe change little pockets of it, or individual people's lives. I think is basically what we're going for here.
Hmm.
And the change that I guess I would like to see, or that I think we really do, maybe we do have this impact, is to be able to just make a space where people can talk about and think about and explore sexuality in a way that isn't just completely characterized by shame and guilt and
Mm.
secrecy and moral condemnation. Because in my experience, that was always the way sex was talked about, in my life, even as an adult. It's just, that's, we were talking earlier before the show about how, there's so many times, it's just hard to find content about sex that doesn't get, it's going to be demonetized if it's online, or it's going to be relegated to, oh, this is in that section of the bookstore, or things like
Mm.
that.
Hmm. Yeah.
Where there's just always this kind of sense like, oh, I better keep this a secret, what if someone sees
Behind the
me?
bead curtain. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
and it would be great. I would love it if people could just be talking about these things openly without having that little background, little itch in the back of their head going, "Oh, should I
Mhm.
be embarrassed? Is this shameful?" And that's what I would love to see, is to just make that more normal for people, and for people to feel more normal, because you're normal. You're not broken.
Yeah, that's about the most critical message I think we can share. Maybe I'll use that phrase a lot, but it's important to stress you're normal.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, no matter how it hangs or dangles or smells or whatever else, it's normal. It's beautiful. Uh, Laura, how about yourself? I mean, I know that our impact may not be huge, but it is sincerely global. I mean, there are members of the Atheist Community of Austin. There are YouTube viewers all over the world. So what kind of world can we help make for your kids?
I love that you asked the question that way, because I love what Kara said about the tearing down the veil and making it not awkward, making it not unusual. And I think we have a really, really powerful narrative that we're fighting against, especially in terms of sexuality, but also in terms of gender and relationship structures and just pretty much everything revolving around the sort of sexual side of being human. Or whatever your gender role is, right? There's just a lot of really powerful messaging that we have to fight through. And so when I think of SecX in terms of what it can do to help my children, I actually, this is going to sound really peculiar, but children are getting better sex education, I think, today than they were when I was younger. And then it's definitely like 50 or 100 years ago, much better than that. But where they still need a lot of help, and where we can specifically help, is for us to educate the adults that are now raising those children, right?
Mm.
So that more children are in environments where it doesn't have to feel awkward to begin with, right? So like my children, for example, as they're thinking about or reflecting on or trying to determine what their gender or their sexuality or what they want for relationships is as they grow older, I want them to be in an environment where that is the least of their stresses, where they can just think about, oh, this is what I want, or oh, this is how I feel, or this is how like I am inside. And not have to stress about, well, what are mommy and daddy gonna say, or am I gonna be accepted if I tell them this, you know? So I think the more parents that get good sex education, the better it's gonna be for those children. And then hopefully as they grow up, they will pass on that good sex education or that good sex positivity on to future generations, if that makes any sense. So
Oh
I
yeah.
I know that our reach is really small, like you said, and that's for now. Like it's not to say that more people won't be reached in the future, but we're also a drop in the pond. There's other good, positive, sex positive education out there, whether it's websites, books, other YouTube channels. Not that I'm trying to advertise away from us, but we are a drop in the bucket, right? And
Sure.
so our voice does matter. And then when you put all those voices together, maybe it doesn't feel like we have an impact, but I think we do. Like we are part of a movement that is having an impact. And I just hope that the more that we get our voices out there, and the less willing we are to give up and to just keep pressing on, the better it will be for our kids to not have to deal with all those struggles that we dealt with when we were growing up.
Sure. Yeah, and we'll talk about that that very real impulse to give up. When you see the
Right?
direction the world is going and you see things in the news. I mean, I know that we were all very emotionally impacted by the overturning of Roe, as well as just so many other big news stories this summer and the last several years. There's a lot to be said about compassion fatigue and burnout and this sort of thing. And hopefully we'll be able to talk about that more at the end. But I appreciate what you're saying about how adults need to be having these conversations, listening to this content, having these thoughts themselves before they can ever communicate it to kids. As a therapist, parents will so often say things to me about how uncomfortable it is to talk about sex or sexuality with their children, and they'll start
Yeah.
to get blushy and awkward and shy
Yeah.
in the conversation with me. And if you can't talk to sex comfortably with me, there's no way you're going to be able to say it to somebody who's like prepubescent. Because if
No.
you aren't talking about these things as an adult, if you're not talking about them on some level, in some appropriate way with your partner, with your friends, with your family, then how are you ever going to be comfortable enough to do it with a snotty nosed teenager who just wants to make you feel
Right.
awkward and get out of the room, right?
Right? So
No,
kids are
and
gonna get sex
that's
education one way or
Mm,
another, but
mhm.
when it comes from things like media and their friends or what little education they get from school, and then they have it negatively reinforced by their parents feeling awkward about it, right? I just think that it makes it so much more difficult, and then it also makes them feel a lot more shame. Like, "Well, I learned about this, from a place where I wasn't really supposed to, and my mom
mhm.
doesn't know I know about it." And so it just becomes this, like, huge, awkward, twisted, and maybe all it is masturbation, like, something very simple and something
Yeah.
very natural, right? But anyway, Kara, I know I cut you off, so go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, you're fine. Yeah, I was gonna say basically the same thing. Like, it's just I I feel for the people who are having to explain it to their kids who probably themselves didn't get good sex education when they were older and were made to feel ashamed and guilty and everything. But yeah, you're exactly right. It just communicates that. I mean, if the kids are probably not going to remember anything from the conversation except how awkward and uncomfortable it was and how much they don't want to repeat that conversation. and
Mm,
and you're basically, that's all you're communicating is the shame and the guilt and the fear and the embarrassment, and then they're gonna, just pick that up. And like you were saying, now how are they going to be able to ask a question later, if they want to know about something, because this is a bad topic to talk about, and
Yeah.
that's definitely not good for anyone. So yeah, I
yeah.
hope that we can do better with that.
Well, so to that end, I mean, for myself, I believe that the most important thing SecX can do is to just get people comfortable with talking about sex and sexuality. We'll do episodes on this show that I think apply to just about everybody when we're talking about masturbation or when we're talking about, scary things going on in the news. But
Mhm.
oftentimes we will do sort of a deep dive and we're discussing maybe relationship styles of non-monogamy and these different things that they're just never going to be you. Or maybe we're talking about homosexuality, or maybe we're talking about some very, very niche kink that isn't yours. And that's okay. Like, I'm not trying to recruit anybody to any of these things. And as important as the quote education is, I don't even know that I necessarily need anybody to walk away from this show with like a memorized list of all of the different kink communities
Right.
or all the different ways to explore their sexuality. But if having heard it once, if having us in your ear while you're at the gym or, putting this video on in the kitchen while you're cooking allows you to just be more comfortable listening to adult people talk about adult human sexuality in a comfortable,
Exactly.
safe way, then we're doing a lot there to just take away some of that shame, to just normalize these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
if by doing this show we can help just one person avoid some of the mistakes that maybe you've made, what would you tell them? I mean, Laura, I didn't mean to cut you off there. If you want to finish that thought and then maybe let us know, like, what is sort of the thing that you wish you had been told?
Yeah, no, what I was going to say really quickly was just that sometimes when we talk about sex education in this particular format, it's not about educating in terms of like people learning a bunch of stuff. It's about desensitizing. It's about normalizing and making people, like you said, comfortable. And so I just kind of wanted to reinforce that and
Hmm.
basically say exactly what you said, but in my own words.
Sure.
Because sometimes it's good to hear it twice. But no, I really think that when you talk about educating about sex, there's so much out there that just allowing a person exposure to the concepts and just
Mm.
exposing people to different ideas is sometimes enough just to get them thinking and doing their own research or being brave enough to say, oh well, maybe I can go talk to my partner about this kink or about my sexuality. And I have these different ways now that I feel empowered to do that because I was exposed to it or heard somebody else in their story. Um, but in answer to your second question about, and I can't even remember exactly what your question was, but it was actually, can you just restate it? That way I don't
Yeah, I
butcher
mean, maybe one
butcher
way to
anything.
think about it is the struggles that we all have growing up in this culture
Yeah.
around gender and sexuality. I mean, what's a message you wish you could send back in time to save your younger self from some of that pain?
Oh, that's right. Okay, yes. Be curious and ask questions.
Mm,
So much of my sexuality was kept even from my own self. Like there was a lot I didn't even know about myself when I was younger because I didn't know the questions to ask. I didn't know to think about it or identify it in a certain way. And I'll tell you, like one example is my sexuality. I call myself like bi or pan, depending on what you want to call it or what your definitions are. But I was traditionally more attracted to women than men, and I found them more sexually pleasing. And how I would justify that as a creative and artistic person is I would say, well, women are more artistically beautiful than men, but I'm more attracted to men, right? Like I want to have sex with men, but I find women more beautiful because artistically, they're softer, blah blah blah.
they're
And I had
just
all
so
these like
fair and
loops. Yeah,
lovely.
I had loops I would jump through, and to the point where I was convincing myself. I didn't even know that that is a form of attraction to women because I was denying myself that opportunity to reflect on it.
Hmm.
So I just if I could talk to younger me, it would just be to be more curious and open and ask more questions instead of just buying the party line, hook, line, and sinker and not really questioning whether or not those preset concepts about culture are actually whether they're true or not, whether they're accurate, whether they apply to me, right? So just yeah, ask questions and get curious.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so much of the religious narrative around sex and sexuality is this is this and that is that, and that's all you need to know about it. Like, there's a inherent assumption that you will just know how to have great sex as soon as
Mm.
you show up because it's quote not complicated. I'm here to
But it
tell
is.
you for all of the books about sex that I have read and for all of the many, many, many that I have not, shit is weird. Shit is complicated. If there is one part of our humanity that is, let's say, multifaceted and complex, it has to be the way that we love, the way that we express ourselves, the way that we sexualize things. I mean, there's so much nuance to that, and our Christian worldview is so much that a man and a woman and then God somehow and also sex, and that's it. You don't need to be curious. You don't need to ask questions. We've already explained it all here. You've got Song of Solomon, and that's all you need. And that is such a heartbreaking idea.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
I never understood that obsession with it's like in the Christian church and they never talk about sex except they get all excited to teach you about but the Song of Solomon teaches about sex and you read it though and it's these metaphors and it's poetry and I'm like how
Palm
are we
trees don't turn me
constructing
on, buddy. Like, what do
yeah
you can we
Yeah.
get a little bit better with our yeah. Mm.
yeah I'm like what's he
When they're
doing with his
feeling
hand I don't understand.
right, but when they're feeling, like, extra super duper honest, they kind of present it as, like, hardcore porn. They're like, "No, no,
Yeah.
no, 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 the Bible can even be sexy too. Look at the Song of Solomon," where they, like, refer to her nose as, like like a camel's back or some shit like that. I can't remember exactly what it is, um but yeah, no, it's from that biblical perspective, that is incredibly pornographic, and So then that kind of like sets the tone of like, well, that is about as raunchy as it gets, right? Anything raunchier than that is just plain wrong.
Right, right.
Yeah, and we still haven't actually learned anything about, what we're
Yeah,
gonna
that's a
do.
crucial part. I mean,
True.
other than like that concubines are great and all of
Right.
those kinds of ideas. I mean,
Yeah.
let's all agree that no matter how you feel about the Bible, it is somewhat inadequate in terms of teaching us
Mhm.
about healthy human sexuality. And so a little bit of curiosity, a interest in learning new things and stepping away from this zealous assumption that you already have it all figured out, that if it's not in the Bible it doesn't count. I mean, that's just lazy. And so I appreciate that we can offer some reprieve from that. But Kara, how about you? I mean, if you could save your teenage or adolescent self from some of this heartache, what's the message?
Oh man, yeah, I would go back to kind of what I was touching on earlier when I was talking about what I see, our value that we can offer to the world, and it's just to not let people make you feel guilt and shame for not being the way they want you to be. If I had skipped that part of my life, that would have been awesome. Because
Mm-hmm.
Right.
from a gender perspective and from a sexuality perspective, that was always a thing for me. I was always, kind of gender nonconforming as a child. And, being in the fundamentalist evangelical, megachurch environment, that didn't play well with others. And, I did internalize that, even though I always, found myself, very, very resistant to the gender roles and everything that were being preached. I still internalized the idea that I was the one who was wrong. I was
Right.
broken. I should feel bad about not being able to identify with all of these things. And, I kind of took that and internalized it. And on top of that, with the idea of sexual relationships being very taboo and shameful and guilt ridden, I ended up taking that into my adult life and getting involved in relationships where I was afraid to talk about them, didn't want to share them with other people. And then I would allow my partners to basically tell me what was good and how I should be.
Mm,
And, I
sure.
had already internalized the idea that I was wrong. There was, I was doing it the wrong way. My enjoyment and my pleasure was one, not important, and two, weird and not normal, and,
Mm-hmm.
just out of the realm of possibility. And so I ended up just kind of thinking that, well, that must be the case, unconsciously kind of, soaking
Sure.
that idea in, and being in these very unfulfilling, unsatisfying, you could even argue in some cases abusive relationships as a
Mhm.
result, because I let people treat me, the way that I had kind of absorbed that, I'm not the important one, and I'm doing it wrong no matter what it is. And I think, being able to not absorb that messaging would be awesome
Yeah.
for kids, and young people, and even older adults. Like, you may have absorbed that messaging that everything you're doing is wrong and shameful, and you need to be this way or else you don't count. And listen, that's not it.
Yeah, well, and that kind of messaging that we get just routinely around our sexuality, not only does that damage our connection and our relationship with our gender and with our sexuality, but that pervasive message that you are wrong can really start to soak into other areas. I mean, folks who are neurodivergent, for instance, can go
Mhm.
a lifetime without ever experiencing diagnosis because they can't talk about those differences, because there's a belief and an assumption of this like homogenous culture and who you're supposed to be. And if you already know that, well, who I find attractive or who I want to fall in love with or how I see myself in the mirror, how I feel about my body, if those things are, quote, wrong, then why should your suspicions about your brain or your personality or these other things
Right.
be any less, quote, wrong? And so we just start burying them, and it can really take over our lives.
Mhm. Yeah,
You know what I find is
absolutely.
interesting, like, especially with young people, is that even if they're told, like, what other people think doesn't matter, don't worry about it, like, just stand strong, that it doesn't always necessarily help, right? Like, when even as an adult, sometimes it's hard, like, when "Hey, who I am is just fine, and
Hmm.
I'm good, and I'm normal," and then you hear that, like, slander or slur or insult, it's still you still kind of internalize it and have that moment of, like, yeah, maybe I am a dirty person or a bad person, or maybe what I'm doing really is wrong. And it's just it's almost like programmed into you, like you can't even help it. So I think the more that we're given the opportunity to empower ourselves, and the more that we give young people the opportunity to empower themselves, I think that the easier it is to kind of ignore that evil little voice that pops into your head when you do hear that stuff.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I
Yeah.
want to remind people that we do have lines open and that they're welcome to call in. I'm going to let Kara take us to the phones in just a moment. But first, I suppose I'll just take a moment to say that the thing that I would love if all of this effort did one thing and just helped one person, I would like to think that there is somebody out there who is able to listen to this show and just know and believe and understand that sex is allowed to be important. You know, that is not a message that I was ever able to receive. As a kid, as an adolescent, as a teenager, even as a young adult, you look around and it seems like everybody is always talking about sex all the time, while simultaneously telling you that it is vapid and frivolous and unimportant. And why would you ruin a relationship over, quote, sexual compatibility? I mean, what kind of like freaky pervert slut are you? And how would you even know if you're compatible? You're compatible with everybody because God says so. Or, I mean, just the idea that you're allowed to leave a relationship because of sex. You know, not to
Right.
say that every relationship has to be hot and steamy, but these things are allowed to matter to you as much as anything else matters to you. Like it's okay for sex to be something that you spend money on, that you spend time thinking about, talking about, participating in, preparing for. It doesn't need to be just, 45 seconds before, the late night TV show comes on. It's allowed to matter in your life, and that is just something that I definitely never heard and desperately wish I could send back in time for myself.
I love that.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
Mhm.
That is excellent advice. I feel like we're all on the same page here with our
Yeah.
advice. Don't let other people's bad advice and embarrassment ruin, your enjoyment.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah,
just
fair to say.
don't let anyone steal your joy.
I love that.
It's
Yeah.
a cliche, but I mean, I love
And
it.
it's hard to do sometimes, but yeah, it's true.